Today is Friday, January 17th, 2025. You have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here with my podcast partner and co-host, Mr. Wallace Smith. Mr. Smith, how are we making it through winter in the South?
Well, I'm doing all right. I've become a sweater guy. My wife is I'd say it's going to sound like she's complaining about my complaining, but she keeps hearing me talk about being cold. Oh, I'm cold, this and that, and anyway, so she's got me some sweaters, and she and my children decided they look nice, so I'm wearing a sweater.
That's nice.
Right now. Yeah,
I was talking to a friend of the podcast, Mark Sandor, and he's reminding this was not his intent, but he did remind me again about how what do they call it when you standard deviations.
Oh yeah, sure.
Winter in Wisconsin is 3 standard deviations away from winter in the South. It's just a whole other level.
Yeah. Oh yeah. This is relatively wimpy, compared to what they got up north. But yeah, let me just say I'm getting by. Now we are going up north a little bit. Things have been it's been a really busy week. We have TWP up north in Mr. Bauer's area. In fact, we'll be spending the night there tonight. I'm very much looking forward to doing that. Very busy. It's a brand new TWP theme for me. It's going to be a new presentation. But yeah, I think they are expecting snow. I think he said their driveway might actually be kind of iced over. So anyway, we'll be going a little bit further north and experiencing at least a little bit colder than it is here in Charlotte.
I found what Mr. Sandor said. It was just the weatherman on the TV. And, Tuesday's high would be 10 degrees, and it was labeled as not as cold. Okay, I've delayed us enough. What are we talking about this morning?
Well, today is an idea I've had that I've been kind of pondering, even personally, in my life. But it hit me that I do think it would be helpful for our audience, our teenagers in particular, but our young adults, we don't want you to write that off because actually it might be in one way more applicable to you, but definitely for our teenagers. So today we're going to talk about getting to know your parents, actually treating them as people that you should invest in and get to know more closely, and hopefully give you some practical ways to kind of kick off such an effort.
So you're saying parents are people too?
Parents are people too. People we should get to know.
Sounds good. Let's discuss.
Thank you, Jake and Julia. And during our brief little pause there, Mr. Robinson was just reading the temperatures Mr. Sandor is having to deal with. And some of the forecasts there included phrases like high of -4. And all I can say is enjoy, Mr. Sandor. I'll take our weather here any day.
Yes.
So I wouldn't say it's like Texas, would you, Mr. Robinson? No. But it's definitely closer to.
Yes.
Definitely closer to.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, so what prompted me today to have this idea, and I appreciate Mr. Robinson thinking that it'll work, is that, well, it's going to sound a morbid way to start, but my mother and father are dead. They are no longer among the living. They died quite some years ago, sort of earlier in my time here in the ministry. And it was really only, I remember the first moment, I said, wow, I was still serving in St. Louis, and I was thinking about my mother. In fact, I think it was before my father died. My mother died first. They were divorced, so they didn't live together. And it hit me. I was actually thinking about myself, which, very self-oriented. I was thinking about myself and kind of had a question about myself when I was younger, and realized, she is the last person that I could have asked. No, it wasn't her. Well, I guess because my dad would not have known. It was something that I knew my dad there wouldn't have been much point in asking my dad. My dad would not have known. Only my mother would have had any particular insight in that regard. And it was too late. There was going to be no asking my mother about this. Now, in that case, I don't know that I would have even been, I actually can't remember what the question was, but I know as you grow older. When I was younger, I probably would have even had enough self-awareness to even think, I'd like to know this about myself. But it was kind of the beginning of a journey and things I've noticed here and there that while they were alive, and this is not going to be, we talked about this before the podcast, this isn't meant to be a giant listing of regrets. I'm very grateful for the life that I've had, grateful for the opportunity I did take with my parents. But at the same time, I realize there's so much that I didn't get to know about them before they died that I wish I had. There's aspects of them our parents, they definitely have an influence on us. And you can't just say, well, I want to discover all those things that about them that have influenced me, because it's kind of like saying I'm going to just read all the really profound verses in the Bible today. Well, that's ridiculous. You kind of have to have a relationship with the Bible where you're reading and engaging in it regularly, and then God will show you things and you will see things here and there. Well, in this particular case, like I remember then later when my father died, I was there during the visitation, and there weren't a lot of people coming, but a fella did come. I never met him before. He was about my dad's age, and knew him in high school. And I remember him when he discovered I was Gary's son. He said, actually, they might have called him Smitty. Inside the family, they often call him Gary, and outside the family, they often call him Smitty. But he said, "Oh boy, I gotta tell you, your dad really cleaned my clock once." Oh man, he told me a story about where they got in a fight, and Dad just really, apparently beat the tar out of him. But he's laughing about it. He's talking, and he essentially saying he deserved it. Whatever. We're not encouraging you to fight, kids, just so you know. But yeah, that's a story about my dad I didn't know. I remember my mother referring once to a young lady that I don't know if my father was engaged to her. They got married in their late 20s. I don't know if he was engaged to her or if she was just a girlfriend. Again, I grew up in the world, and my parents certainly did. But she ended up dying in a terrible kind of accident. I won't go into details, but I think as a car accident of some sort. And she talked about Dad kind of going a little off the rails there for a period. And I never felt comfortable asking him about it, though honestly, as I got older, I kind of wish I had. I know Dad's nickname was Louis Liverlip when he was in the Army. I haven't talked to him about much of his Army days. And all I have, because he did have kind of a scar on his lip, and I think he said that had to do with the time they pushed him down the stairs as a joke. I don't really know, But again, I'd like to know. I know I'm going to get through this list here pretty quickly. I know my mother had me by C-section, and I don't know why. I don't know if that was just the thing to do then. I didn't know if that was because, and I was a firstborn, but I wasn't really a firstborn. Kind of find out, my mother actually had a child out of wedlock when she was much younger, a half-sister, which I got to know later, and didn't even know that until after my mother died. And it's possible that birth was a C-section. I have no idea, because back then that was kind of if your first one was C-section, then all of them were C-section. But I'd like to talk to her about that, because I do know I spent the earliest, after I was born, they stuck me in one of them chicken warmers. But the boxes for they to keep the child warm, because I had a hole in my heart and one of my lungs was undeveloped.
Wow.
Yeah.
Were you premature?
See, there you go. I don't know. Clearly, I was put in that situation for a reason. Now, I know when my son Benjamin was born, his lungs were still a little moist. He hadn't gotten all the moisture out, and so he was in the ICU for babies for a brief span, but he was not necessarily premature. But see, I don't know. It's literally one of the questions that I wish I had been curious enough to ask. I grew up at the Church of Christ, which my mother tried for a while and decided she did not like that, so she did not attend there. She went to, I think, a Lutheran church, and then eventually realized she can get a lot of laundry done on Sundays if she doesn't go to church. But I attended Church of Christ, which my dad did, and that's where my grandfather was an elder in the church, and my grandmother attended. And then eventually, after my grandfather died, my dad, who really wasn't very churchy, if you will, realized at times if he showed up and my grandmother wasn't there, that he could just sneak out after the quote-unquote Lord's Supper and just not go the rest of the time. So he was really just going because my grandmother was going. But my grandma was very serious about it, and clearly my grandfather was. And I don't really know. I know they didn't always live in Lancaster where that church was, but I do believe he was always Church of Christ. I wish that I way too late to ask my grandparents, but I wish I had talked to them more about that. My aunt, and I'm almost done with this list. My aunt, my father's sister. The only thing I know about that kind of background was a story she wrote after my grandfather died about how she remembers revivals going on across the street. Not their church, I think some other church, but they would sing hymns there, and then she and my grandfather standing on the porch kind of singing hymns along with the crowd across the street, and talking about how he knew how to play guitar, and I've never heard him play guitar. Okay, all of that is just kind of a taste of things over the last, I would say, 10 to 20 years that I've come to realize I say 20 years because they died before that, but it's a rounding off. I wish I had talked with them more. I wish that in the time when I had access to them so much more readily during the first, say, 20 years of my life, I wish I had thought that my parents are people that I will one day wish I had gotten to know better, not just for personal reasons, but just to realize that I'm plugged into that history, and I wish I'd known about that. Part of it I do see as a reflection of the fifth commandment in Exodus 20 about honoring your father and mother. The idea that honoring your father and mother is more than, at least I believe it's more than just obeying them when you're in their household, but also thinking of them as individuals who are worth investing your life in to get to know, that they're people that occupy a place in your life, that it's wise for you and honorable for you to kind of invest in knowing them to some extent. And then the only other verse I'd planned on mentioning today is in Proverbs, and that's all. Say the commandments are in Exodus 20, but it's Proverbs 20, and verse 5. In Proverbs 20 and verse 5, which I just typed in extremely poorly into my software. Here we go. Proverbs 20 and verse 5. It says, counsel in the heart of man is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out. And I was reminded of this passage, and I was just recently reading in John 4 how the woman at the well interacts with Christ. And he talks about, if you'd asked, I'd give you living water. And she just says, oh, the water in this well is really deep, and you hadn't even brought anything to draw it out. Where are you going to get this water from? Well, it just reminded me that, yeah, this was something in a very practical sense, that sometimes wells went really, really, really deep, and you had to come equipped to go deep and to bring that water out. And water's heavy. Water, you get a sack full of water in some of these wells, and it takes a lot of effort to bring that to the surface. Well, recognize that people are, this is going to sound stupid and shallow, but people are people. I'm not trying to sing a Depeche Mode song for those that get that. I'm just saying that, yeah, people are there's more to, they're a person like you are a person. That is just like you would give to yourself some room for the fact that you have some complexities, that you are living a rich life second by second, and you're not skipping any moments. You're having to experience it all, and you're moving through life. It reminded me of the commentary that Mr. Thomas White here in our department wrote some time ago. I'll try to add a link to the website. He talks about sonder, which is this made-up word. It's not a.
Did he make it up?
No, he did not make it up.
Okay.
And in the commentary, he says who made it up, and I can't recall who made it up, but it does remind me of that quote from, is it one of the Avengers movies where they're talking about Thor and he says some word and they said, oh, it's a made up word. And what Thor says, all words are made up. It's like, oh yeah, all words are made up. But this is an actual artificially crafted word. It was purposefully made up, but it's meant to communicate a sense. Sonder is the word that this particular writer attached to the idea of when it suddenly hits you that each of the people around you is living a life that is just as rich and full and first person as yours, and that they had a day like you had a day, and they're actually going through life. And I appreciate that some guy tried to make a word for that, because I think that is a bit of an unusual sensation. And I'm hoping today to inspire you to think of your parents that way, as people that, I don't know how old you're, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 22, whatever, that your parents lived through just as much life at your age as when they were that age. And to see your parents as someone that you only have a limited amount of time to tap into, and then you won't have that time anymore. And if not your parents, there are some whose parents may not be available to them anymore. Or, there's situations where maybe there's abuse and situations like that. I'm not saying go seek that person out, but I do hope this is also extensible to the other people in your congregation. Some questions, and you're going to want to respect your parents who, when they say that there's some things they don't want to talk about, that needs to be respected. But also some of these questions you might ask your parents, you wouldn't ask a member of the congregation. But I do hope there's some principles here that are extensible to other people in your life, especially those of experience and the adults.
do you think you could take that scripture and, as Mr. Gwynn would often say, in other words? And I'm a little concerned that it's not obvious the meaning of that scripture to some.
Sure. Proverbs 20 and verse 5.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let's read it again and then let's talk about it. It says, counsel in the heart of man is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out. Well, let me just use you, Mr. Robinson. Mr. Robinson is one of many individuals that I will counsel with from time to time. It's a privilege to be here at headquarters and actually have Mr. Gerald Weston, right. Mr. Rod McNair, Jonathan McNair, all these individuals around. You know, if you got something on your mind, I can literally go downstairs and talk to Mr. Mario Hernandez, right? So, but Mr. Robinson, you are among them. I do counsel with you from time to time and appreciate you very much. But, you know, I'm in my office, and admittedly, you're probably the laziest person I could go to office-wise. You're right next door. But on the other hand, still, I've got to get up. I got to come, and I got to, knock on the door, see if you're available. And it might take some effort to explain what it is I'm looking for, and then you will give me your response, and maybe your response indicates that maybe I haven't communicated well. Some things are, we've talked about things sometimes, Mr. Robinson, that are kind of hard to communicate.
Yes.
Where we've talked enough. We developed a language for that. Like, okay, this isn't exactly what I want to know, but it's in the neighborhood of what I want to know. It's this and that. So, but it does take some work. But that said, that work is worthwhile work. It doesn't mean that what you're going to say is the perfect answer or
right.
not. And yet at the same time, it is worth tapping into your experience and your wisdom. And just like pulling water out of a deep well, it's straining on your muscles, but the water is worth it. That's why you're there. That that the counsel that is available from individuals around you, various ones, certain ones, maybe not every single one, is worth the effort it takes to try to draw that counsel out of them.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yep. I wondered also in your application for parents and even grandparents, while you were talking, it made me kind of think about, when you get to let's say you're younger and you have grandparents, or you're becoming grandparents yourself. Well, older, we're less adventurous later in our life, typically, right?
Yeah, normally.
And so, and we're older and therefore a little less energy, a little less activity. And so, if you're younger, you just look at a grandparent and assume they've never done anything interesting in their life. But really the opposite is by far most likely true, that there was an incredible amount of adventure that led to where they are now being a grandparent. So I read this a little bit and wonder, it's like, just think let's say there's grandparents and you really like them and you love to have them come around and visit and everything. And turns out grandpa did all these amazing things, but you got to take the time to talk to him and access that deep well of wisdom and experience that they've had. It would be slightly different, maybe what you're looking for, but you got some effort. You have to put in some effort to draw it out, but you might find somebody who's older has a rich life filled with experiences that you could benefit from in talking to them and understanding what they went through. So I remember I did the same thing growing up. I kind of assumed very, very wrongly that my parents didn't live a very interesting life and I'm the one having the interesting life. But we weren't always old youngins. We were young one day too, and we went through the same process you did.
Yeah. I'm so glad you put it that way. It reminded me that on my Twitter feed, which I still refuse to call it X, but on my Twitter feed, there's a lot of, I say mainstream Christians, but I'll just say big name denomination Christians, Lutheran fellas, Catholic fellas, and others, evangelicals, debating about the influence of Andrew Tate. And we have a podcast on Tate's influence. Actually, a two-parter. One of our two-parters actually in the older stream. Go to livingyouth.org, click on podcast. You can see the whole list. But like people are complaining, Christian men need more role models, and that's why they're going out there. There's no role models. And I appreciate what one guy said in response to that, because it's easy. It's very easy to think that. And indeed, there are a lot of, say, effeminate, like legitimately effeminate, quote unquote, role models that are being handed to young men these days. But like one guy said, he said, if you're in a congregation and there is a man there that has a happy marriage, 3-4 kids, and a good steady job, that's a role model. That's someone who's doing it. That's someone who's literally succeeding in the life you want. And that's kind of part of what I'm saying is that a role model doesn't have to be someone that YouTube decides to feed you because the algorithm has decided this is something you're going to watch. It's not even, the algorithm doesn't even care if you're going to benefit from it. The algorithm only cares that you're going to watch and possibly buy a product. But as a result, we're so used to being fed. No, the good stuff is the deep water you have to work for. And that guy that has that happy family and kids isn't going to say, hey, youngin, let me take you aside and let me share all my life's experiences with you. No, you're going to have to decide, I've got to get some of that. I've got to get some experience. I want to talk to this person. I want to build a relationship. And it's going to take work.
I think it was the richest man in Babylon that highlighted that most people that have been successful and wealthy were all too happy to tell you how they did it if you ask them. It's not like it's some secret that they don't want other people to have. Probably because they know it was hard to do what they did, but they can at least give you the recipe. I can't remember if it was in that book or not, but it conveyed a lesson that I've never forgotten, which is, so this could be controversial a little, but it's sort of like the gregarious guy who's living in a trailer, and he's going to tell you how you get rich. Okay.
Right.
It's not shade at living in a trailer. I briefly lived in one. That's not the point of it. It's like if you want to have a wealthy, comfortable lifestyle and be living in a mansion, you don't go ask somebody who's not living in a mansion.
Right.
So,
right.
Good point about the successful parenting. I mean, that's, hey, how'd you do it? Anyway.
Yeah. It does remind me. I've thought this before. I remember. Well, like say a situation where you have a young individual struggling with the marriage, say a husband. It's like, we've been married for, 5-6 years, and I feel like it's not working. It's not working, and think, if only I had someone to, get advice from. Instead, they're going to get books, whatever you find in the bookstore. But sometimes there's an elder in your congregation who has 6 children. Has been married for 50 years, and you could be writing him off because you're just thinking, his sermons aren't very exciting, or his, it's okay. I have a hard time staying awake during his sermons, but you know what? He's an ordained man who has literally succeeded at marriage for 5 decades and has children who love him and he still has a relationship with. Don't write off those people. Those are the people that they don't have to be flashy, and YouTube's not going to offer those people to you. But if you're willing to put in the effort, you have something to learn. And our parents, in that way, are our most immediate neighbors and available resources. They're the ones that not only have this kind of experience you can tap into, but also they're the ones that know you. Even if you think, my parents don't really understand me. Okay, maybe. However, they still have experienced your life from the earliest days and can be a resource that there's literally no other human on earth who can satisfy.
I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I try to avoid making it be my personal relationship or my personal life. But because my daughter, Maddie, is married, and I can now feel, I'll admit, I feel like that's a success. I mean, to get married, to have children and have them come through healthy and normal, and they grow up and they learn their lessons too, and then they meet that person, and then they get married, and then in time they'll have their own children. And to see, I was there for all of that, to see that. The process go through is just incredible. I know there's a lot of, we know you older listeners are out there, you tell us, but who've been through further down the line and understand this very well. But it's just so amazing actually to have witnessed that. And I've thought a lot about how God has constructed our life and how perfect it is to take us through every level of understanding.
Pretty profound, Mr. Robinson. That's exactly right. So
I'm a deep well.
So those things in mind, we thought, because it's one thing to just say. Mr. Robinson and I were talking about this recently, that I know earlier in our speaking careers that sometimes we'd have a Well, actually, it's not exactly the same. You talk about a call to action, or was it call to action, or was it like, for me, I know it was practical application. Like, hey, that's great, everything you just. In fact, the first time I was called out on it, and it was, I say called out. The person was very respectful, but I'd given a Bible study to singles at a feast site. I think it was in Branson, and I was talking about the importance of the work, because it's one of my favorite themes. It really is very important. And she came up and said, "Wow, thank you for that. That's exciting. So what does that mean? I mean, what do I do? And I'm like, oh yeah, well, I don't know. I don't know what you do." And I realized, we do want to make sure we talk about turning things into action. What sometimes it is a matter of understanding something, to be sure, but sometimes it also is a matter of turning things into action, especially in a case like that, because next thing you know, there are people out there making their own pamphlets and passing them out. What does it mean for the work to be important to us? Well, it impacts our prayers. It impacts things like that. I did a sermon on that. But in this case, okay, so we're encouraging you to get to know your parents and beyond your parents, focusing on other people in the congregation, people that are your elders in many ways. It doesn't mean an ordained elder necessarily, but among them, but especially your parents. So how do we do that? Well, I'd like to recommend is actually too strong a word. I'd like to offer for consideration a few questions. I'm not saying these are the questions you must ask or should ask, but questions you could ask, hopefully to model the kind of discussions. And yeah, hopefully there's natural times to ask such questions. In fact, I'll try to wrap up on that when we get there, is to take advantage of natural times. And if once you're programmed in your mind to see your parents as a resource, see your parents as individuals you want to know information from, well, then questions will come more naturally to you in certain moments. Maybe you're looking to buy a car, and it finally hits you, well, not just what I need to know to buy a car. Hey, Dad, what was it? What was your first car? How did you get? You'll be primed. The pump will be primed to ask your parents these kinds of questions. But to do that, I'd like to kind of prime that pump, if you will, by giving you some example questions. And some of these might seem kind of obvious, but and actually many families listen to us, and so we have parents listening right now. So they're hearing us prime you with these questions. So parents, keep in mind your children might be hitting you up after this. So we just want to give you a few questions as samples. For instance, a great question, something a lot of people kind of want to know later on in life, is how their mom and dad first met. If you don't know the story of how your mom and dad met, I think that's a worthwhile
what
conversation.
If you knew the story and then over years it kind of faded and you don't remember exactly the details?
I think that would qualify.
I should ask my mom again.
Yeah.
We finally were able to go down and visit her just a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
And twice I called her 83 before she said, I'm only 81. I was like, oh, sorry about that. I felt bad about it, but my mom is still alive, and it is nice. Periodically, a little new story comes out or something, a data point I didn't know. I should refresh myself on how they met. They were both at Ambassador College. Like I know the basics of it, but
right. I'd like to know that story. I do think, because I think I know how my mom and dad met, but I have to admit I'm not 100% sure, and I feel that's kind of part of this. Is also, I think it's worth investing in your family history, being able to pass on stories from others, because there's a saying, a sad saying, a sobering saying, that, let's say, absent Christ's return, we do pray he returns soon, but in terms of the normal course of human events, there is unless you're super famous like Napoleon, there is a day when someone will have their last thought about you. Mm-hmm. And then you will never be thought of, again. Yeah. And, I kind of like to think when it comes to families, we have an opportunity, at least for those that came before us, to make that as late as possible. I'd love to be able to tell it. The latest story I can actually tell of any of my relatives is a great-grandmother here or there, and only one that I actually met. But anyway, ask your mom and dad, how did you meet? And going further, not just how did you meet, how did you conclude that she or he was the one you wanted to marry? Right? Now, they may have had, that might have been a terrible rationale or calculation. They might have said, well, honestly, she had great taste in shoes, or I have no idea what thing. They might say, but don't pick them like I did, son. Not that I don't love your mother, but, let me give you, but that might be a door to other kinds of advice, because a lot of us were dumb when we were young and didn't know what we were doing.
What a good point, because I have heard, I cannot think of one right now, but I have heard disastrous reasons for having gotten married, and then but it worked out anyway.
Yeah,
kind of thing.
yeah. Well, and even, because a lot of you increase the odds that the relationship didn't start in the church. And I remember a very awkward moment many, many, many years ago as a young 20-something in Spokesman Club. And I was all the guys, and I was a Toastmaster, and all the fellas were married. And I thought, oh, you know what? It'd be a fun way to introduce them, talking about how they met their wives or something. It was really fitting for the moment. And I asked this one fellow, and actually, and I had waited a bit late to ask the guys the questions, so there was no turning around, and because the club was going to be starting, and here I am procrastinating, and so I asked, oh, wow, how'd you meet? And you could tell he was completely caught off guard, and it was a story he did not want to tell. Ooh. It was, and I get the impression that it was their pre-Christian life.
Yeah.
And he kind of dithered about it, and then finally just said, well, you can say we met over breakfast. And that was that. And I immediately regretted that I'd put him in a spot like that. But at the same time, if it's family, still you can talk about those things and you can learn from that. And you know what? A parent might be able to say, well, you know what? Actually, it was not the smartest marriage. I ended up even dating her just to make somebody else jealous, and it just kind of went, too far. Whatever you say, but you know what, son? I realize I'm going to make this work. You know what I'm saying? It could be the beginning of a story where you learn a lot. So, but you don't know those stories until you ask. Yeah. And by the way, implied in all these questions is that it's not kind of like I used to teach in the speech class at camp. This is just the beginning. I mean, listen for information. There might be more you want to ask about. There might be more linger. So, think of these as seeds for other discussion.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's one. Another one. And this would be, well, it might depend. There's different ones. Like Mr. Robinson is, what generation in the church are you officially? I can't recall. We've discussed that before.
I am third.
Wow. Because I am first. We average out to second.
It was actually pretty classic. My grandfather and his wife, they lived down in South Texas. They heard the broadcast over the radio. Back then, they didn't have the radio stations under control, and they had very powerful megawatt transmitters before they kind of
ramped it down.
Yeah. And so they were going when my dad was 5. So I'll count that. My dad basically grew up in the church, except for his first 5 years, and my grandparents the whole time, and then us. So. Pretty
100% counts. Starting at 5, my wife started about 5 too, and clearly was second generation. So this question can vary, but if your parents did not grow up in the church, then you can ask, how did you find out about the truth? How did that start? And you might think, oh yeah, I know. But then kind of like Mr. Robbins was just saying, then you start thinking about it and realize, well, I don't remember all the details, so maybe getting to find out about that. But if they did, like, actually, if your dad, Mr. Robinson, was only 5, he may not remember as well. But it also might be a matter of saying, hey, when, like, especially if they're a little bit older, when your parents started attending, grandma and grandpa, what was it like for you? Like, was it hard? Because I have heard of parents who were maybe 8 or 9 when their parents started attending, and I've heard both ways. Some talk about how, and I just felt like my whole life changed. Suddenly I couldn't do this, and I couldn't do that, and I couldn't do this. But others are like, man, it was a relief. Suddenly it's like a lot of things made sense, and I feel like I was more excited than my parents were. So you hear the different stories,
definitely.
But don't let those stories go unknown, right? Find out, ask those stories. I imagine with your dad being 5, he probably barely remembers anything before the church.
I don't ever remember him saying that it was difficult or hard or anything, and I mean, maybe officially went when he was 5, but I suspect they'd been listening for a couple years, so maybe they didn't even keep Christmas. Like starting traditions and then dumping traditions is much harder than having never picked them up at all.
That's true. So. That's true. Well, I know my wife tells a story. I'll probably get it wrong. She'll let me know if she hears the podcast, that when they started attending, she got in trouble at school for telling all the kids that Santa was fake.
Yeah.
She's
well, Maddie's is still doing nanny work for this family, and she's seen the first boy grow up since he was 1, maybe. Anyway, here's the point. They love her. She does a great job. She's really bonded with the kids. But But she says the one thing I think I would actually get fired for is if I told them that Santa wasn't real.
Oh, yeah. Well, people definitely take Santa very seriously. And let me put as an adjunct to all of this, you can also apply these things, and I know I've mentioned other members of the congregation. Let me also say your grandparents. It doesn't have to just be your parents, but even though we're giving a special focus on them right now, but your grandparents as well, because I'm reminded of tales like from what is it? I think Mr. Carl McNair. A story I've heard various sources of going out, and actually I think Mr. Meredith, maybe in the autobiography, he talks about that, about going to visit people in the church, and the not happy husband or whatever comes out with a gun. And I mean, people don't realize religion is kind of taken sort of weird today. It's just sort of either it matters or doesn't. But man, things
Back
were
in
still
the day.
serious back then,
Yep.
and you were coming, and so you never know what kind of stories you might get to tap into. So let's broaden from that in terms of just trying to understand what it was like for them growing up, taking the time to ask them, hey, what was it like growing up with grandma and grandpa? Not just trying to find out what was grandma and grandpa like, but the world they grew up in was very likely in many ways different than yours, even if it was just a different time. I know my dad, and I know barely anything of this life. I grew up on a farm, worked on a farm. I've seen pictures, black and white pictures from the farm. And our life was nothing like that. We had a suburb life, and then his brother was a coach for a high school football team. Actually, so was his brother-in-law, my aunt's husband, and no farm at all. My grandfather stayed in farming in the sense that he still grew. He had a huge garden, but that was their whole life, for times. And I know practically nothing about that. And I've seen pictures of them that make me wish I did. In fact, it's kind of funny. I wish I could talk to my grandfather. There's a picture, because so often my children are just called the Smith boys. People just talk about, Smith boys, this or that, even though they're men now, but still, even people say that. And I remember seeing a picture of my grandfather, and I think his, I can't even remember how many brothers he has. I have to go look at my chart. But his 2 or 3 brothers posing with a couple of girls, and they're out there on a farm, but they're young men. And it was labeled visiting the Smith boys or something. I thought, that's kind of is really cool. But, there's a whole life, and there's experiences they had that figure out a way to tap into, figure out a way to ask them, what was it like growing up in blank, where you were, or what city you lived in, or like I know that while my grandparents and my mother and father lived in Lancaster, Texas, I also know he ended up being buried in Waxahachie because they spent a lot of time there in Waxahachie, and that was where a lot of their life was. But I know nothing of it. I don't know what it was like. I don't even know why they moved from one place to the other. Did my grandmother and grandfather move to be with my dad when they settled there, or did he pick that city because his mom and dad were there? I have no idea, but I would like to know.
Yeah. Well, my grandfather, he was born in the 1920s, but he was raised by a hard man. Like, our family's history goes back through Texas, like back to the Stephen F. Austin's first settlers moving into Texas. And one of my great-grandfathers was briefly a Texas Ranger. So, like, it was
really,
just a different world. And so my grandfather, I always remember him as being kind of stern and hard, and he wasn't fun to talk to. But towards the very last few years of his life, he became a little more relaxed and a little easier to talk to. And I feel like that's a great example of, it was a shame I didn't learn more from him, because if I'm honest, you kind of avoided him because he could lock you into a awkward conversation where he doesn't understand why you don't know anything about roots or leaves or trees or anything. And here's one example. So he got cancer and knew he was dying, so he tried to write kind of an autobiography just to record his experiences.
Right.
And I read, he only got maybe 50 pages in, and most of it was about his World War II experience, which I'd never heard talked about very much, because it wasn't anything terribly glamorous. Believe it or not, that's my guess.
Right.
I'd heard that he was in World War II. I heard he flew planes, and I was like, was it like a fighter pilot? And they were like, no, he flew freighters. And so anyway, I'm reading his recounting of it, and the main thing that I came away with was how frequently somebody died somebody you knew died. So he's over stationed in Scotland, which is how he met my grandmother. My grandmother was Scottish, never changed. I don't think she ever got a U.S. citizenship, as far as I know. And he's flying these freighter planes, but they're like flying gas cans. They don't have radar in them. I want to say some of them didn't have a radio, but I might be wrong about that. And he's writing this nonchalantly, like this was just the history. But like every single day was, we lost, Johnny and Danny Boy flew into the side of a hill because it was foggy and they couldn't see.
Oh, wow.
All the time. So maybe he's not flying a fighter plane getting shot at by the Germans, but like apparently flying a freighter was just as dangerous because so much fog, so many hazards, and not modern radar the way we use it now, or the instruments to fly without being able to see. You need to be able to see where you're going.
I can't imagine how terrifying it is flying without being able to see, especially when the instruments weren't, what they are now.
But just fascinating, and I do regret that I didn't get to hear more from my grandfather in particular, of how he grew up and some of his experiences. That would be, like, I knew a lot about my dad, and I had about a 10-year period before he died where we spent a lot of time together, and I would ask him questions and learned a lot about, I don't know, it was very, very nice, and I don't have any regrets, but my grandfather would have been nice to ask him some more stories.
Yeah. And, you present kind of an aspect of kind of working to get that information that isn't just a matter of keep continuing to ask until it comes out, but sometimes, there's the old stereotype of, if you go talk to so-and-so, they're just going to spend forever telling a story. But you know what? Used to be, that's what people did. I remember they listened to each other tell long stories. It wasn't like TikTok or YouTube Shorts where it's like, oh, good, that was entertaining for a minute. Now the next one's going to be entertaining for a minute. I know when we go to Kentucky, that's where my mother's family lived, and we would stay with my grandmother and grandfather. And it was one of my favorite activities, which is kind of weird as a kid. I was a professional, destined to be a professional sitter, because my grandfather was your classic guy that would just sit on the porch and watch people all day. He was retired. His health he had diabetes. He was kind of going downhill for years. And he would just sit out and just watch. And, fewer and fewer people are walking by anymore as life moves on and everybody's in cars. But man, sitting next to him and just watching the world kind of slowly creak by. But it was only in doing that, as he's telling stories, and I can't tell you everything he said, but every once in a while, amidst all the things he would say, is this real banger, this real story that I'll remember about the kid that what was fun for them, going out in the field and throwing rocks at each other. It's just what you did. It's what you did. You didn't have video games. You had friends to throw rocks at, and they end up putting a guy's eye out. One of his friends, they end up hitting him right in the eye, and he loses an eye.
Well, you remember how Dr. Meredith would talk all the time about when his friend Jimmy.
Oh, yeah, and they wrestled.
He
talks about
and he
that
died
in the autobiography. Yeah.
Man, he never forgot that. That was a real foundational experience, for Dr. Meredith. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't recall. I know I think Mr. Bomer found like the newspaper clipping of that.
Oh, I read it. It was fascinating. It really hit the whole community. That's something that I didn't fully realize was like his dad was somewhat notable and it was still smaller towns back then compared to what they are now. And that was a big deal.
Yeah, so there's other stories my grandfather told me I will not repeat, on the air. But that said, they're precious memories of mine now, for him. And I remember times when we would go walking and it was up and down the alley, and you start to realize, literally the only reason we're walking is so he can walk with his grandkids and we can talk, and that's about it. There was no other goal, other than, maybe him keeping his legs, functioning. But anyway, but those kinds of moments, you gotta dig in there and you gotta get them. Other questions you might ask. For instance, my dad had Uncle Pat and Aunt Glenda, my uncle and aunt. My dad was the oldest, but one thing I'd never asked him, and it's kind of late, that I'd really like to know would be, did you actually get along with your brothers and sisters? I got to see them interact here and there, but mainly as adults. Like my sister and I, we get together and we love each other very much. I appreciate my sister. We almost never see each other. And yet, when we do, we get along really well. My kids would probably have no idea watching us now just how much we sometimes detested each other and the things we had to work through when one could really irritate the other, which we did, of course, clearly work through. But, I had this, you have this sometimes this love-hate relationship with your sibling, this other individual you're trapped with. And to know what my parents, what your parents, listener, what was it like with their siblings? I don't have enough stories, but I know one my father would tell, and it's so difficult because now he and his brother are both dead, and I hope I get the names right because it could be the other way around. The only two things I know about them interacting were, well, one was that my uncle was left-handed. And somehow they would always frequently sit at the table where their elbows would bump, and it would just frustrate my dad. It's like, why don't you sit on the other side? You elbow, those kind of things. But also, I think it was my uncle's habit. I don't think it was my dad's. Would have the habit of coming up behind his friends and did it to my dad, and throw his arm around their shoulder. Yeah, you're just buddies. You just throw but would then just reach up and start grabbing the other guy's earlobe and just kind of messing with it. And it just kind of creep them out. Like, what are you doing? Why would you do that? And he did it purposefully to creep them out. And realizing that here are my adult father and uncle who, my uncle was a football coach, and he's a leader of young men. But to hear about their times when they were younger and it would make them more relatable to me, but also give me some context for their lives, interactions, and then context for my own interactions with others. So there was one example. Another question, priming the pump, what jobs did you work? I know my dad's first job was not the one he had when I was born. He had other jobs, and I have no idea, what those are. And it's good to know, it's easy to start off a life and feel like you have no idea what you're doing. But you got parents that did the same thing, right? They had a first weird job coming out of school, or even while they were in school, taking the time to ask, what was it that they did? What was it like? Another question to ask, asking even what places they lived. I don't even know. All I know is two cities my father lived in, and then the one my mother lived in. And yet that's something worthwhile to know. Sometimes they've been crazy places. That happens all the time here at headquarters. Like when Mr. Hernandez was here and talked about spending a year alone in a forest, up top, spending most of his time on a watchtower by himself with the Bible and God and trees. What an astonishing story that if time goes on, and let's pray that Mr. Hernandez and all of us are alive when Christ returns. And yet, if he hadn't been here on a podcast telling that story, I never would have known that. And now it's something I think about at times when he's not even around. I ponder what that would be like. Well, your parents have experiences like that. They have places they've lived. They've been in cities. So all you know of them in the country. Well, that was that time they lived in the city, or vice versa. It's worth asking.
Yeah, definitely. That was an amazing podcast to get to have with Mr. Hernandez.
It was, and I highly recommend, if anyone hasn't heard it, just scroll on down at livingyouth.org or go to our podcast page and look for that one. On YouTube, it's one of the more popular ones. Another question, actually, thinking of podcasts, one of our more popular podcasts, Mr. Robinson, I think, has been the one on crushes. What do you do as a young person if you have a crush on someone?
Wait 6 weeks.
Yeah, I think we did say that, didn't we? But yeah, in fact, if you don't even know about that one, that's because that was one of our earliest ones, I think. I think he had one of those with the other microphone. The sound wasn't clear. But anyway, go back and listen to that one if you want. But at the same time, it's also a question for your parents. Ask your mom and dad, did you ever have a crush on somebody? Why not tap into a little bit of their life experience, and to kind of see, well, what was that like? How did they handle? They may not want to talk about it. At the same time, maybe they would. I feel like, let me know what you think, Mr. Robinson. You went to, you're public schooled, right? You went to public school like I did too. And I feel like because school creates this environment where you are surrounded by your age-wise peers all day long, that it kind of trains us to just go to our peers for their experiences and not to go to, say, our parents or grandparents. You're so used to talking. So if you have a crush, well, you're talking with all your friends about it in school. And what you're not doing is coming home and talking to mom and dad about it, right? And saying, I really like Susie, or whatever, that case is. And that's too bad, right?
Yeah, no, that's a good hypothesis. In fact, you know what it made me think of? I think we could support your hypothesis with the Bible.
Ooh.
But I hear other ministers use this not infrequently, but it was the time that Solomon had died and his son Rehoboam was. The other tribe leaders came to Rehoboam and say, "Hey, could you lower the taxes? Your dad had them pretty out of control." And
Right.
he did ask the older guys, and their advice was boring. But he went to all his younger guys who were his peers, and his buddies, and they gave him frankly terrible advice, and it had disastrous consequences. So definitely the hazard of not asking people with experience their thoughts on something and just only going to your peers. You're going to get a very limited scope of what is a good solution or a good path.
Yeah. Mr. Robinson, that's one of the many reasons, I like having you around, bringing out that Bible stuff,
Yeah.
good job.
Look, kids, it's all in there. There's nothing you've encountered or experienced that if you fuzz the details a little isn't covered in one way or the other in the Bible.
Yeah, very much. Oh, okay. That's really great for us to close down on. In general, trying to wrap things up here. In whatever, if you get into a mindset where you realize my mother and father are just like my friends, just like other people I know, they're human beings. It sounds ridiculous to say, who have lived a life, who have experiences. They went through their life 1 second at a time, just like I did. And they're a reservoir of experience. I'm not even saying it's all we're not talking about your parents being perfect. But at the same time, if you only counsel with perfect people, you'd have to pray to Jesus Christ and could never talk to anybody else. And that's not how God made things.
Yeah, no, it's not.
So you have your parents there, and some of you still in your life, and they're accessible. They're available to you if you're teenagers and if you're young adults. But they won't always be there. I'm not trying to end on a sad note, but to recognize, in a sense, they are a limited resource. And if you can adopt this mindset that, my parents are people, they're, God says, love your neighbor. Your parents were the first neighbors you ever had. Think of them as someone that are worth investing in. They're worth bringing those stories out. And if you get in that mindset, you'll find that you won't do it just because you have a list of things. It's like, oh, here's the great wise list that Mr. Robinson, Mr. Smith gave us on a podcast. But it'll become a little more second nature. And when you're changing jobs, say, part of your thinking will be, I wonder if Dad's ever gone through changing a job before. I wonder if Mom ever did that, before they got married and she was at home, whatever the case is. And you'll learn to start doing that. It'll become more natural. It's going to sound like a weird thing to say, but I'll leave with an idea from George Orwell, of all things, which sounds like I'm going to talk about a dystopia, but I'm not.
It does.
It does, right? But I don't agree with the way George Orwell went with this philosophy. But because he was very much against, I think, even capital punishment, things like that. It gave him a certain view of life that I still think is valuable. And he kind of like the concept of Sonder that we mentioned earlier. George Orwell writes that, each individual person that you see or that it's almost like a whole world. It's like an entire world. It's a world of experiences and sights and sounds and memories and geographies and landscapes. And just like you are like a world that you have experienced, every individual has that world packed in them, but it's a different world than yours. It's some other perspective and such. Well, your mom and dad, each of them have this world, the worlds they lived that they formed on their own, but then worlds they eventually merged to make unified in some way. Have a mindset where you want to tap into that world. There's a collection there of experiences that only they have and that you only have a certain amount of time to harvest. And so get to know your parents.
Not everybody probably knows the link, but my wife's mother was Renee Strain. And Mrs. Strain, like we talked about earlier, came into the church when she was 16.
Mm.
And after she died and like things were over, because it was a lot leading up to that, it really hit me, probably more than anybody else, that a vast amount of church experience, church lore, wisdom, balance, like she had a very natural I don't know how equilibrium. She just, you don't let things get to you. God's in charge, but it really, I realize we can never ask her anything again. And I know that's obvious, but when you get to that moment, it still really hits you, and the loss of her wisdom and encouragement and the many wonderful aspects that she brought to the lives of the people around her in that instant was gone forever.
Right. Well, into her resurrection.
Yeah, sure.
But but not accessible in this life anymore. And so, take advantage of the time you have. It's not just a matter of fighting regrets. It's a matter that's just a wise and great thing to do.
Smith and Robinson.